Hi, my name is Khumo. I am a somatic coach, a licensed therapist, and a DEI and mental health consultant. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, click around, like, comment, subscribe, whatever the tubers say. Is that a thing? Do people say? Poke around, look at what you'd like, and I would really appreciate a follow and a comment if anything that I say speaks to you. So today I wanted to talk about the idea of consent. I saw this video and I'll try to put a little clip of it, but I'm just going to do a little bit of an explanation of what happens in the video. These hijabi women are coming down an escalator and this man on the other side of the escalator puts something over their necks, and it's, I don't know, one of those just a thing that people put around their necks when they're at like a party or something. And he kind of laughs and they kind of awkwardly giggle also, and then they kind of take it off. And it cuts to this guy who, he kind of says stop touching hijabi women without their consent. And then he was like, well, then I was gonna say stop touching women without their consent, but that's also wrong. And eventually he goes on to say, honestly, just stop touching people that you don't know, because it's weird. Stop it. It wasn't intense, but I had a reaction to it where it kind of reminded me of, and if you're in South Africa and you've been in the clubs here, there is this culture of, not even here, I think this is, having lived in the US also, I think this is a thing that happens everywhere, just when it comes to men in crowded or public spaces, passing women and touching them. Touching their hips, touching their bodies in whatever way, non-consensually, in order to pass them. And it's interesting because I've been out and it annoys me to no end. But I've been out and also observed that when it comes to men, there's a lot of this kind of action, right? Like just moving past or just a tap to pass the person. There isn't any, honestly, non-consensual touch that happens between men in spaces. And again, of course, this video is not about to be all about men, but it's about to be the concept of consent. Who has it, who doesn't have it, who's allowed to have it, because I think that it's a really big cultural conversation that I really think we should be having. So, when I think about consent, I think about the ability to say no. And the actual definition has something to do with permission, right? Like asking someone's permission to do something. And I think it's interesting when I think about what first comes to my mind, that my socialization has made consent about, well, you're also allowed to say no. If someone is asking permission, it doesn't mean you have to do it or you have to say yes. And that kind of seems intuitive, right? That you should be able to say no. It makes sense. As an adult, I can acknowledge, yeah, I'm allowed to say no. How easy is it to say no is then the next question, right? I want to first talk about the way that culture, I don't want to say it's South African culture or US culture, or individualistic or collectivistic per se, but there is this culture, especially around children and consent, that is really concerning and worrying. And I think in a lot of ways, we don't think about what the future holds for the things that we teach young people now. For instance, culture teaches children that they're not allowed to have consent. They aren't allowed to say no. And this extends even more so to socialized girl children. Hug this person, be in contact with this person, don't say no to adults. Do what adults tell you to do. And when you don't do those things, you're considered rude or disrespectful. And what that teaches young people is that they don't have control over their bodies. And this is a big statement, right? Because if you are teaching a young person that they don't have control over their body, that people who are older than them, by virtue of having double digits in, their age, or just somebody who is older than them in general, if you're teaching young people, you always say yes to people who are older than you, or you always do what this older person is instructing you to do, what that then teaches is when they find themselves in an experience with an adult that they don't know, they're going to do what that adult says. And this is where we find so much abuse, sexual abuse specifically of young people. And, you know, the thing about consent is that the things that we learn in our childhood sit in our bodies and they follow us our whole lives until we become conscious of it and try to unlearn it. And even then, unlearning that is really difficult. Think about it like learning a language. When you're younger, your brain is just this sponge for lessons from people around you, people and spaces around you. And as you get older, it gets harder to learn something new, to incorporate something new. It takes a lot more intentionality. And so when we are teaching young people, well, because you're a child, you must listen to adults. And when you're an adult, you get to make your own decisions. What's going to happen is it's not that easy, right? When you get to 18, you're not going to suddenly flip a switch and be able to say no to people who are older than you, or be able to even know what it feels like to not want to do something. And that's the part that's really important. And a lot of the work that I do as a somatic coach is tapping into what are the lessons that your body and your nervous system learned when you were younger that are now manifesting themselves in your adulthood and kind of forcing you to make decisions that maybe you don't really want to make. A lot of the time, you know, one thing that comes up for folks in therapy and coaching is not really knowing how to identify the cues in their body that tell them that they don't want something or don't want to do something, or even sometimes that they do want to, right? We kind of just live in this space where we exist for the sake of pleasing other people because that's what we were taught in our childhood, right? And part of coming into these healing spaces is trying to learn how to come back to yourself and practice consent with yourself. So that moves me into this piece about how this kind of relates to sex and sex education, right? A lot of people don't want to talk about sex to young people because it's inappropriate, because they're too young, because of maybe what we think they'll do with the information. But what we end up doing is robbing young people of the capacity to learn, how to listen to their bodies, to learn what pleasure feels like, and to know in what context it feels good or not good, right? Such that if you're able to teach a young person and model, especially as a parent, right? If you're modeling, you can say no to me. When your child is with an adult who asks them to do something that they don't want to do, that's probably inappropriate, they're still going to be able to say, no, I don't want to, right? And it might anger that person. It might create a rift between you as the adult and that person. And often the reason that we don't want children to say no is because we are uncomfortable with the repercussions of that no. That now my child will be perceived as rude, as inconsiderate, etc., etc. And so it becomes really difficult for us to figure out how do we culturally protect young people while also kind of holding space for these experiences of quote-unquote respect, right? This narrative that older people deserve respect no matter what. And that's the piece that we have to unpack. That's not really true. That adults can be really awful to young people. And if young people are not allowed to say no, are not allowed to point it out, they're not going to learn when they're actually in an unsafe situation that they're allowed to not partake in this experience. And so as we grow older, right? Let's say you've socialized a young girl, especially, not to say no. To kiss people, to kiss adults on the lips that they don't want to kiss, to interact with people they don't want to interact with, to stop what they're doing immediately and attend to another person, right? How do these forms of quote-unquote respect in our culture then affect them in adulthood? It affects them in the sense that now this person might get into relationships with men who don't listen to them, right? They might struggle to identify what it is that they need in sex, meaning there is a wealth of issues that happen, right? Now, sex is not enjoyable. Relationships are not that enjoyable. And we kind of unconsciously force ourselves to be in them and perform this role of a person without needs because that's what we had to be when we were younger. And so you see the long-standing effect of not teaching young people that they're allowed to have consent. And so how do we teach it? What happens? How do we navigate this experience of consent, right? Because as parents, of course, you don't want your child to be in an unsafe experience. As parents, of course, you also want your child to be respectful and kind to other people. And for whatever reason, we seem to think that those two things can't exist at the same time. That if you teach your child to say no or to listen to their body, that they're at the same time not going to learn to be respectful and kind to others. And if you watched the video before this one where I talk about the idea of community, I mentioned how to kind of navigate this idea of listening to myself so that I can choose to show up in spaces that might be uncomfortable, or I can choose to show up in spaces and be my best self in them. And that's the thing that we, for one, want to teach children. That they're allowed to say no, that they're allowed to change their mind, that they're allowed to, quote unquote, disappoint people older than them. So that when they're older, when they're in sexual experiences, for example, they're able to communicate what they need to a partner, notice if someone cannot meet their needs, and make decisions based on that, and not believe that their worth is tied to how much they can please another person. And so I feel like I've gone around in a circle here. But something that, if you're thinking about kind of engaging with somatic coaching with me, this is part of the work that, we kind of go through. Thinking about how can you start exploring consent with yourself? Because consent is not just about sex. Consent is not just about permission from or with other people. Consent is also about ourselves. And it starts with the really small things in our day-to-day experiences. So one tip I think I'd like to give folks who are, if any of this resonated with you and you're thinking about, well, how do I begin to kind of build consent with myself, which is a really important place to start. Think about something as simple as choosing to get out of bed in the morning. Think about, am I giving myself, do I have consent from my body to get up, to move into the next part of my day? And it's such a strange thing to think about, right? That, every day we have to get up. We get up every day. It's part of being a human being. But in reality, if we slow down and we listen to what our body is saying, right? This is where experiences of self-awareness really come in. If I think about this morning specifically, I got up and I didn't get out of bed immediately. I noticed that I was experiencing pain. I have a chronic pain condition. I noticed that I did feel more alert than yesterday, which means I think I slept better than I did. So I could get up, but I also noticed that I was in pain and I needed to shift my day around to accommodate my body. My body was not giving me permission in that moment. It's most comfortable at its most comfortable space, which is something that I'm allowed to access right now. It needed me to be in bed. And so that's one example, but thinking about the small moments where you can give yourself consent. If someone says, hey, do you mind pouring me a glass of water? And let's say that you're in a totally different room, right? This is a moment to practice consent. Of course, sometimes we do things because we care about people and we love them and we want to do things for them. And also, it's a moment to think about, well, what's going on right now, right? Because there's a moment where someone can ask you to do that and you could be like, yeah, sure. And it doesn't feel like there's anything else going on for you. But there will probably at some point be a moment where someone asks you to do something and you've just finished crying, you've just gotten up from a nap. There are things that are happening for you that might warrant that you need a little bit more time. And I want to encourage you, even if you do end up getting up to go get the glass of water, just to take an extra beat to think about, how does my body feel about this request? It's a great way to kind of get in touch with what your body is telling you. And this is a lot of the kinds of exercises that I do with folks in somatic work, that we think about, well, what is your nervous system, your body cues, your feelings, the sensations in your body telling you, right? That when somebody says something to you, does it feel safe, the thing that they said? How do you feel when they said that thing? What is your body telling you, right? Can you give yourself consent to engage or consent to not engage in something. I feel like I went a bit on a tangent, but I hope that this made sense. If you would like to work with me, I am still taking on new clients. I will put that information down in the description along with a contact form. If you are also looking for sex education work, I do that for young people from the ages of 5 to 95. You're welcome to reach out and we can talk a little bit about what it is that you'd like to do or share, and if I can help you. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.